The year is 1566. Istanbul breathes with the slow, heavy rhythm of an old man. It is a strange paradox. The Ottoman Empire stretches wider than ever before, from Algiers to Basra, from Budapest to Yemen. Its army strikes terror in Vienna, its fleet in Genoa. Venetian merchants whisper in the ports that the Sultan is fate itself, clothed in brocade. And fate itself, at this very moment, lies in his campaign tent somewhere beneath the Hungarian fortress of Szigetvar. He is 71 years old. He is no longer Suleiman Kanuni, the lawgiver, whose justice became proverbial, not the Magnificent, whose brilliance once outshone the kings of Europe. His body has betrayed him. Gout has shackled his legs so that he cannot mount a horse. Historians will later write of dropsy and edema, but the essence lies not in the diagnosis, but in the condition. Suleiman the Magnificent can no longer rise without the help of slaves. On campaign, he is carried in a closed carriage like precious and terrible cargo. It is here, in the camp at the walls of the defiant fortress, that the most absurd and brilliant performance of the 16th century is born. The Sultan passed away on the night between September 5th and 6th. His heart likely gave out under the weight of years, illness, and the colossal strain of this final campaign. But the world will not know of it for another 48 days. While his embalmed body slowly makes its way home to Istanbul, his death will be the empire's greatest state secret. His court physician will sneak into the tent each morning to maintain the illusion of treatment. The viziers will receive orders, supposedly conveyed from behind a curtain. And the body, dressed in ceremonial robes, will be paraded solemnly past the troops as if the Sultan is simply too weak to show himself.
Why? The answer lies not in a single fact, but in a puzzle of fear, pragmatism, and cold calculation. A state built on the absolute, almost sacred authority of one man could not permit even a shadow of a vacuum. The heir, Selim, was far away. The army was hundreds of miles from the capital, surrounded by potential enemies. One rumor, one tremor in a messenger's voice, and the grand empire could collapse into a bloody struggle for the throne, right there on enemy soil. And so began Operation Silence, the greatest deception in history, where the lead actor was a dead ruler and the directors were his terrified dignitaries. We will dissect this performance down to the bone, from the last breath in a campaign tent to the poison that awaited the unfortunate courier who raced to Istanbul with the terrible news ahead of schedule, from the medical report that reads like a detective novel to the genius public relations that turned physical infirmity into a symbol of spiritual grandeur. This is the story of how one man's death became a stress test for an entire civilization, and how that civilization responded to the challenge with a masterpiece of cynicism and political genius. And here, the story of Suleiman ends, or rather, its official version does, but we've only just gotten a taste. If you're interested in digging deeper than the official chronicles and seeing how the cogs of history actually turn, you're definitely in the right place. Subscribe so you don't miss a multitude of uncensored mysteries of Ottoman history. On the 1st of May, 1566, Janissaries and Sipais marched through the streets of the capital to the deafening cacophony of the Makhters, military bands. Golden armor sparkled under the sun so brightly it hurt to look, and in the center of this shining monster, this military machine capable of grinding whole kingdoms to dust, sat an old man in a litter. He was 71 years old.
Suleiman the Lawgiver, whose name struck terror from Vienna to Basra, was now waging a war on two fronts. The first against the Habsburgs in Hungary, the second, more cruel and merciless, against his own body.
Gout had twisted his joints into knots. Every step echoed with a burning pain. His heart, which once withstood marches lasting days, was now failing, treacherously skipping beats and forcing him to gasp for air. Swelling in his legs turned simply sitting into torture. But the Sultan came out to the troops. Why? Let's cast aside the romance. This was not a heroic impulse. It was a cold, desperate political calculus kneaded with personal agony. The Ottoman Sultan is not merely a ruler. He is the living embodiment of power, the leader of the Ghazis, the sword of Islam. His sacrality rests on three pillars: victory, justice, and physical perfection. By 1566, two of them had cracked. The failure at Malta the year before was a national humiliation. The Knights Hospitaller, those fanatics dug in on a rock, repelled every assault. The Ottoman fleet, which had seemed invincible, returned empty-handed with overflowing sick bays. In Istanbul, whispers began. The Padishah's hand has faltered. His time has passed. Emperor Maximilian II, hearing these whispers, immediately stopped paying tribute. It was an open challenge. To leave it unanswered meant to officially admit, yes, I am old, weak, and I no longer care for the world's respect. But there was an internal threat far more terrifying than any European monarch: the Janissaries, the empire's elite infantry. They adored Suleiman the warrior, Suleiman the victor, but would they be as loyal to Suleiman the invalid, wasting away in the harem of Topkapi amidst the whispers of eunuchs and doctors? The history of the Ottoman dynasty knows the answer: no. A throne left unattended instantly became a target. He had to mount his horse, if only symbolically. And he mounted, or rather he was mounted.
He made most of the journey from Istanbul to Hungary in a closed carriage, a humiliating mode of travel for a commander whose youth was spent on campaigns. But upon approaching cities during troop inspections, a painful ritual took place. The Sultan was lifted up. He would overcome waves of nausea and dizziness, most likely with the aid of opium tincture, a medieval painkiller. He was placed on the calmest horse, his turban was straightened, his shoulders were squared, and before the eyes of thousands of soldiers appeared not a decrepit old man, but the shadow of Suleiman the Magnificent, a direct gaze, a regal posture, a mask carved from pain and will. Behind this facade lay emptiness. By 1566, Suleiman had outlived almost everyone who had given his life meaning. His hureng, whose letters he carried with him on campaigns, had died 8 years earlier, leaving silence in her wake. His friend and Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, executed by his own order. His most capable son, Mustafa, killed due to a slanderous plot with his silent consent. Another son, Bayezid, had rebelled and was executed. The Topkapi Palace had become a museum of ghosts for him, where in every hall he was met by echoes of past conversations and laughter. War, however, was a familiar, almost comforting element. The smell of horse sweat and campfire smoke, the creak of leather saddles, attack plans drawn on maps, this was his language, his only remaining reality. To die here in a campaign tent beneath the banner bearing his tugra was not a tragedy, but a logical, even desired finale. It was the perfect script. Not a quiet death in bed, but a loud departure at the zenith of glory, a moment before a new victory, the last perfect move of the greatest ruler of his age. Before departing from Istanbul, he performed strange, disquieting rituals. He distributed mountains of gold to the poor and dervishes, as if rushing to rid himself of worldly burdens. He prayed for a long time at the tomb of Ayub, the guardian of the city.
Saying goodbye to his few remaining relatives, he looked at them as if seeing them for the last time, and when the procession set off, he reportedly turned to look back at the panorama of Istanbul, at his Suleymaniye mosque whose minarets he had raised to the sky. In that gaze there was no hope of return. It was a farewell. He was not riding to conquer Vienna, he was riding to conquer his own immortality and to exit the stage precisely at the moment he himself would choose. It was the coming triumph that did not go according to script. By August 1566, Suleiman had set out on campaign like a director confident of his film's box office success. The goals were grand, Eger, perhaps even Vienna. Szigetvar seemed a bothersome but minor obstacle, like a stone in an expensive boot that could be shaken out with one sharp kick. The audacity of the Croatian Ban Miklos Zrinji, who had turned the small fortress into a thorn in the empire's side, demanded a demonstrative reprisal. Suleiman turned his army. This was to be a quick action scene before the main show. No one expected that here, in a swampy backwater, the quiet but inexorable finale of the longest reign in Ottoman history would begin. The army made camp, a city of giants against a Lilliputian fortress, 150,000 against 3,000. The mathematics of war left no options. The first days of the siege smelled of anticipation. Any moment now the walls would crumble, the gates would swing open, and they could move on to real glory. But days turned into weeks. The fortress did not surrender. It became a festering sore, an irritating, humiliating splinter. For Suleiman, whose youth had passed amid the roar of victory salutes under the walls of Belgrade, Rhodes, and Budapest, this was not merely a delay, it was a personal insult. Every morning when scouts reported, "Not yet, Padishah," it was a lash of the whip against his reputation as an invincible strategist.
Stress is not an abstract concept. For a 71-year-old body worn down by gout, poisoned by years of opium-based medicines, and undermined by ischemia, rage became a physiological poison. Modern physicians studying the chronicles are almost unanimous. Chronic stress triggered a fatal cascade. Every flash of anger at his sluggish viziers, every bout of helplessness at the sight of defiant towers, each was a mini-stroke for his blood vessels, a strain on his worn-out heart. He felt time slipping away. Autumn rains turned roads into mud, crumbling all plans for a march on the Austrian capital. The grandeur of his final act was dissolving in Hungarian mud. And mud was everywhere. The marshy terrain around Szigetvar became an ally of the defenders and an executioner for the Sultan. Dampness saturated everything, even the carpets in his campaign tent, a portable palace that now resembled a luxurious prison cell. For a gout sufferer, such humidity was torture. His legs swelled, turning into painful, immobile logs. Boots no longer fit. Every movement, even to turn on his cushions, sparked a flare of pain. Doctors increased doses of pain-relieving concoctions, but opiates clouded his mind, mixing rage with apathy, a sharp strategic intellect with delirium. The culmination arrived quietly. Suleiman disappeared. The one who had always been the center of the army's universe, the living symbol of its might, ceased appearing before the troops. There were no more ceremonial rides, no encouraging glances. The janissaries, soaking in trenches, began to whisper, "Where is our master? Why does he not lead us to victory?" The Grand Vizier, Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, a brilliant courtier and strategist, took on the role of director for the play entitled "The Sultan is in Control." Orders were issued in his name, but the voice from the tent grew weaker by the hour. He was killed not by a bullet or a sword.
He was killed by the bomb of his own vanity and Zrínyi's stubbornness ticking in time with the siege. A heart that had served the empire for 46 years could not withstand the combination, physical exhaustion plus an existential crisis. Imagine this scene. In the tent, in a semi-delirious state, lies the man who once redrew the map of a continent, and beyond the tent walls, the roar of his own cannons meaninglessly pounding the walls of a tiny fortress. That rumble became the music of his agony. In a fading voice he would ask, "Has Szigetvar fallen yet?" They would answer him, "Soon, Padishah, very soon."
The heart of Suleiman the Magnificent stopped in the night between the 6th and 7th of September, a few hours before the bloodied garrison would make its final suicidal sortie and before the Ottoman flag would finally fly over the smoking ruins. He died without ever hearing the word victory. His last triumph arrived one heartbeat too late. The small fortress he had expected to erase from the earth within a week had won its most crucial battle from him, the battle for time. It delayed him just enough for stress to do its dark work. The Sultan was 71. For the 16th century, this was an advanced, venerable, and profoundly worn-out age. His personal physician, Kaysunizadeh Bedreddin, a star of Ottoman medicine, had already lost his own war by that night. His arsenal, opiates to tame the pain, herbal decoctions, bloodletting, was like a child's bow against fortress walls. He could only ease the road to the end. The official chronicles, always bashful regarding the death of a padishah, would later write of divine will and a stroke. But Suleiman's medical history, dissected bone by modern physicians, screams of a completely different, far more prosaic and cruel drama. It was a classic case of a multi-stage combination where one ailment struck at another until the body collapsed like a house of cards. The prime suspect, number one, his heart. For long decades, it had borne the burden of an empire. Excess weight, gout that robbed him of mobility, and the titanic, ceaseless stress of ruling a superpower. By that night, the engine of the Lawgiver was likely worn to its limit. The symptoms emerging from the lines of the chronicles, shortness of breath, edema, sudden weakness, pallor, are direct evidence pointing to acute heart failure. The heart simply refused to pump blood any further. But the heart had a faithful ally, the kidneys. Decades of gout, that disease of feasts and abundance, had done their black work. Uric acid crystals had eroded not only the joints of his feet, causing hellish pain, but also the kidneys' filters. The theory of renal failure leading to uremia, the poisoning of the blood by waste products, perfectly explains the confusion, the fog before his eyes in which Suleiman spent his final hours. His mind was poisoned not by enemies, but by his own failing body. And finally, the third player, the banal and terrible soldier's scourge, dysentery. It was mowing down the ranks of his janissaries out there, beyond the tent walls. Some sources hint that the microbe did not spare the padishah either. If that is the case, then the cruel diarrhea and dehydration became that final stone weight which broke the back of an already weak man. Although this version circulates without direct proof, it is too logical in the context of a besieged camp to be dismissed out of hand. So what happened in that pre-dawn hour? Most likely the scenario was this. The exhausted kidneys poisoned the blood, the toxic blood put a monstrous strain on the worn-out heart, and possibly dysentery claimed the last of his strength. And at that moment, the heart, that great conductor of the organism, lowered its baton. Even in this fog of pain and drug-induced delirium, Suleiman's mind worked with frightening clarity. His last question, thrown into the silence of the tent, was not about God, not about the soul, not about his son. It was about the goal for which he had dragged his dying body across half of Europe. Has that cursed city been taken yet? They lied to him, told him soon, very soon. He tried to rise, an old lion sensing the end.
Perhaps that movement became the fatal one. A sharp pain in the chest, a wave of suffocation, a brief struggle, and the body sank heavily onto the brocade cushions. Kaisunisadad brought a small mirror or a feather to the pale lips. Not a single flutter. The pulse was gone. The physician straightened up and met the eyes of the man in whose hands the fate of everything now lay, with the Grand Vizier Sakolu Mehmed Pasha. The Sultan was dead. Not as a legend, not as a myth, but as an old, very sick man who had died of a heart attack in a stuffy tent somewhere in the Hungarian hinterlands.
But at the very moment the breath stopped, the greatest fraud in the history of the Ottoman Empire began. Sakolu did not let the cry escape his lips. Silence, absolute. The body on the couch ceased to be the body of a father, a ruler, a man. It became a screen, a state secret, a strategic asset. The physicians and servants became prisoners of this terrible knowledge. The official medical version concluded here, in the ringing silence before dawn. From here on, the political version began, and it demanded that Suleiman the Magnificent, in defiance of all laws of nature, continue to live, at least for a few more weeks. At that moment, the history of the Ottoman Empire did not collapse solely because Sakolu Mehmet Pasha looked at the body of his lord and embarked on an adventure comparable only to the flight of Icarus. He decided to rule the empire in the name of a dead man. Why was silence golden? Not out of reverence, out of cold calculation. 3 reasons, each deadlier than the last. The first, the army. The soldiers stormed the walls not for money or glory. They believed that beside them was the shadow of God on earth, the living embodiment of divine will. If that shadow were to suddenly vanish, the warrior spirit would dissolve like smoke. The discipline of the Ottoman army rested on a myth, and Sakolu became the keeper of that myth. The second, the janissaries. These men with guns were not just elite troops, they were a corporation with a special contract with the sultans. A new ruler, a new payment, the chulis. Had they learned of Suleiman's death here in the field, the reaction would have been instantaneous and predictable. Not a request, but a demand. Failing to receive gold, they would have taken it themselves, looting the supply train and cutting the officers' throats. The Austrians in the besieged fortress would have been spectators to the bloody spectacle of the Ottoman Empire against itself. The third, the main reason, the vacuum. The only heir, Selim, was far away in Anatolia. The journey to the camp took weeks, and in politics, as in nature, a vacuum is intolerable. In those weeks, dozens of surviving princes, rebellious pashas, ambitious beylebeys could have emerged. The empire could have shattered into splinter principalities like a glass sphere dropped onto stone. The mechanics of the great lie. Sakolu did not convene a council. He became the dictator of an emergency. His first order was quiet and terrible. No one leaves the tent alive. The circle of the initiated shrank to the size of a noose. The chief physician, a few servants to wash the body. Sources whisper that those servants whose eyes saw too much and whose loyalty was in question were strangled with silk cords right there on the carpet. The dead keep secrets best. To those who remained, Sakolu explained the rules of the game without metaphor. One word, and not only you will die, your family will die, your line, down to the last infant. This was not rhetoric, it was an instruction. And then the vizier sat down at a small desk and performed the first act of the mystification. He took a pen and began to forge the Sultan's handwriting. He knew every flourish, every slackness in the pressure characteristic of Suleiman's ailing hand. The next day, the commanders received Hati Humayuns. Increase the pressure, the fortress must fall. The Padishah is pleased with your service. The paper was genuine, the seal real, the signature perfect. Only the author of these lines was already being washed for embalming. The illusion of life requires a soundscape.
The silence around the tent was alarming, and so Sokolu filled it with music. He gave an order to the military orchestra, play, loudly, without pause, boisterous marches, triumphant melodies. The explanation for the army was ingeniously simple. The Padishah, sensing victory approaching, wishes to hear the sounds of triumph. In reality, the thunder of drums and the shriek of zurnas drowned out the sounds of preparations, the smell of embalming mixtures, any possible whisper of prayers. When Szigetvar finally fell on September 7th, Sokolu stepped onto an improvised stage. He stood at the entrance to the tent, holding a scroll, and announced that the Sultan, to great regret, was too weak to appear before the troops, but he was aware of everything and filled with pride. The vizier read out gratitude in the ruler's name and ordered a victory prayer. The soldiers rejoiced, not even suspecting they were applauding the director of a production whose main actor could no longer take a bow. The most difficult part was beginning now. The army, the fleet, and the bureaucratic apparatus had to be led back to Istanbul while preserving the secret. 48 days. Sokolu sent couriers to Selim with a message as concise as the blade's edge. The throne is yours, but for now it is a ghost. Come and make it real. Be silent. All these weeks, the vizier ruled the empire on behalf of a ghost. He held meetings at the closed entrance to the wagon where the embalmed body lay. He nodded, pretending to consult a whisper from within. He signed decrees by the will of Suleiman. He became history's sole channel of communication between the world of the living and the dead Sultan. Operation Silence was not about concealing a fact. It was a full-fledged extension of rule beyond death. Sokolu, the Serbian slave who had risen to the pinnacle of power, for those month and a half became the most powerful man on the planet. He did not steal the throne, he rented it in order to carefully hand it over to the legitimate but unprepared heir.
The journey to Istanbul took weeks. The secret had to be kept along the entire route, and so an operation was launched, equal in its cynical pragmatism to a military one. Not a ceremony, not a ritual, an urgent sanitary evacuation of the supreme commander. The corpse had to be transformed into cargo capable of surviving the road. The candles cast dancing shadows on the tent walls, turning it into an eerie operating theater. The procedure was called tahnit, embalming according to canon, but its aims were far from the eternity of Egyptian pharaohs. There was only one goal: to halt time at any cost until the body could be delivered to the mausoleum. The chest cavity, which once housed a heart beating for the empire, was opened. The cavities where life once teemed had now become a problem. The liver, lungs, stomach, everything that rots first was removed. And the heart. This is where the story diverges from the protocol. A monarch's organs are a symbol, the substance of power. They cannot simply be discarded. Thus was born a division that grew myths more powerful than any state propaganda. According to legend, Suleiman's heart and other organs were placed in a vessel, perhaps a golden casket, but more likely a practical copper cauldron, filled with bombs and sealed with wax, and an act of profound symbolism was performed. This capsule containing the Sultan's inner world was buried right there, beneath his campaign throne, in the very heart of the camp by the walls of Szigetvar, essentially under the bed on which he died. This was not merely a gesture of respect, it was an act of magical geography. The conqueror's heart was forever embedded in the land he was conquering. The Padishah's body belongs to Istanbul, but his heart remained in Hungary. This phrase is not just a beautiful metaphor, it is an exact description of the procedure. His heart literally became a trophy that the empire kept for itself, burying it in the borderland as an eternal spiritual redoubt.
And what of the shell?
the empty chest cavity meant to inspire awe? The second phase began, creating an aromatic illusion. The body was washed according to rite, and then the cavities were stuffed, not just with salt and herbs, they were embalmed with a cocktail of the most powerful chemicals of the 16th century, caustic camphor, animal musk, and ambergris. This scent was not for fragrance, it was a chemical shield. Sharp, medicinal, overpowering, it was meant to be associated by the guards not with a dead body, but with the pharmacy of the Sultan's physician, with the expensive Eastern incense that always surrounded the ruler. Death was masked as an exotic perfume. Then the body was turned into a mummy, tightly wrapped in cloth, soaked in wax and resins, creating an airtight sarcophagus of bandages. A wax mask was likely placed over the face, the final makeup for a possible but undesirable parade. And so Suleiman had two graves, one in Szigetvar, a small earthen mound over his heart, later enshrined by a rotunda turbe, a place of pilgrimage where his passion, his wrath, his earthly biology lay interred. The other, the majestic mausoleum in Suleymaniye in Istanbul, where the shell, the symbol of the state, rested next to Hürrem. The curtain of this drama was sewn from brocade and fear. In the strictest secrecy, by night, Suleiman's body was exhumed from its temporary burial. It had been dead for a month and a half. Even the art of the finest embalmers could not halt physics. Tissues desiccated, the features of his face showed through the skin like the frame beneath the worn fabric of a tent. This was no longer Suleiman the Magnificent, but his shadow, slowly melting in the airless space of the coffin. Then it was not physicians who took over, but makeup artists and set decorators. Their task was akin to that of idol makers. The face of the deceased was covered in thick, almost theatrical rouge, the scarlet pigment of life against the backdrop of death. A massive heron-plumed turban, a symbol of sultanic grandeur, cast a deep shadow into the sunken eye sockets. A heavy brocade kaftan with gold embroidery did not merely clothe the body, it constructed it. The stiff, high collar became a hidden support for the head, preventing it from bowing in a silent nod to reality.
But a static idol was insufficient. It needed a spark of life, at least a single gesture. For this, Sokolu devised a cynical and brilliant trick. The stage was set, the troops were assembled, and in their center, in an open carriage or upon a campaign throne, sat their sovereign. From a distance it appeared thus. Suleiman, pale yet majestic, silently surveyed his army. His gaze was fixed over their heads into the distance, as if contemplating the fates of the empire. No one saw that behind him, concealed within the folds of a tent or behind the high back of the throne, a man lay in wait. Historians debate whether it was a loyal dwarf jester or a nimble page. His role was simple and terrible. He became the nervous system of a dead body. At the crucial moment when janissaries frozen in reverence passed by, it was his hands slipped through the sleeves of the Sultan's robe or his nudges from behind that caused Suleiman's arm to smoothly rise in a gesture of blessing. Sokolu Mehmet Pasha completed the illusion. He would ride up to the carriage, bow respectfully, pretending to catch the Sultan's quiet, sickly whisper. Then he would straighten up sharply and, in a voice full of genuine power, shout, "The Padishah is pleased with your service. He prays for your victories." This was a masterpiece of political theatre. The vizier was speaking for himself, but the soldiers heard the voice of the authority they so desperately wanted to believe in. The effect exceeded all expectations. A unified groan of relief swept through the ranks, an explosion of shouts, "Long live our Padishah!" Battle-hardened veterans wept, gazing at the familiar profile. Their doubts dissolved in a wave of blind jubilation. They paraded past the throne and moved on, towards Belgrade, not as a rebellious herd, but as an obedient army. Sokolu had won the game. He had made death work for the dynasty. His performance lasted a few hours, but its consequences were measured by the salvation of the throne. When the curtain finally fell and a new sultan, Selim II the Drunkard, appeared before the army in Belgrade, the Janissaries had to face a bitter truth.